The morning sunlight streamed through the tall, narrow windows of the downtown courthouse, casting long stripes across the polished wooden floors. The room smelled faintly of old paper, polished wood, and the sterile tang of institutional cleanliness, a scent everyone associated with seriousness, authority, and sometimes fear. It was a mid-sized city in the United States, the kind where everyone knew someone involved in every story. And today, the eyes of many were fixed on the local burglary trial scheduled in courtroom 4B. The trial itself was a relatively routine case. A series of burglaries had rattled the local neighborhood, and police had apprehended a suspect thanks in large part to the tracking abilities of their police dog, Rex. Rex, a majestic German shepherd, sat calmly at the front of the room beside his handler, Officer Miller. His ears twitched as he listened, his nose occasionally sniffing the air, ever alert but perfectly disciplined. He was a professional, trained to focus despite distractions, and today he would unknowingly play a key role in an unexpected, unforgettable moment. In the gallery, the audience was slowly filing in. Local residents, reporters, and a few children of the city's officers took their seats. The trial's official paperwork and evidence boxes were already lined up on tables, a silent prelude to the hours of testimony ahead. Among the audience, a tiny figure stood out, despite her small size. Emma, a 3-year-old girl with chestnut curls and wide, inquisitive eyes, sat on her mother's lap. Her small hands clutched a soft stuffed rabbit, her tiny legs swinging beneath her chair. While most children her age would be squirming, bored, or fidgety, Emma was completely still, her gaze fixed on something at the front of the courtroom. Her attention was entirely on Rex. There was a fascination in her eyes, an unspoken curiosity. She didn't understand the legal proceedings, the accusations, or the weight of the room's tension, but she understood Rex in a way that transcended words. His movements, calm posture, and alert presence spoke to her in a language only children seemed to understand. She leaned slightly forward, her tiny hand brushing her mother's arm as if she was preparing to do something she couldn't yet articulate. The room was slowly filling with murmurs as the bailiff called the courtroom to order. Lawyers organized their papers, exchanged low whispers, and rehearsed statements under their breath. The judge, a woman in her early 60s with stern features softened by faint laugh lines, entered with measured authority. She wore a black robe, carrying the air of impartiality and seriousness, yet her eyes flicked occasionally toward the gallery with a gentle, watchful gaze. Today's case was straightforward but serious. The courtroom's energy reflected that, tense with expectation. Emma's mother, Sarah, tried to keep her daughter's attention focused, whispering softly to her not to fidget. Emma, however, was not distracted. Every so often, she let out a soft squeak of excitement or curiosity, her finger twitching unconsciously toward Rex. Sarah smiled nervously, unsure if she should intervene or let her daughter watch. She had no idea that her child's small gesture would soon become the highlight of the morning, a moment that would stop the room cold. At the front of the courtroom, Officer Miller patted Rex gently, whispering commands that only the dog could understand. The partnership between officer and K9 was evident. Rex's calm demeanor reflected hours of training and a mutual understanding. Today, however, neither of them realized that their usual courtroom presence would be altered by the unexpected innocence of a child's eyes. The trial began with the prosecutor, Mr. Harris, standing and adjusting his tie. He was a man in his 40s, seasoned and confident, with a reputation for compelling storytelling. He began outlining the case, the series of burglaries, the evidence collected, and the pivotal role of the police dog in tracking the suspect through dense neighborhoods and unfamiliar terrain. He spoke with authority, pointing to photos, maps, and security footage, building a narrative of law, order, and community protection. While Mr. Harris laid out the case, Emma's gaze remained unwavering on Rex. She didn't understand the legal jargon, the description of burglaries, or the nuances of evidence. What she did understand was Rex, his size, his posture, his eyes, and the sense of calm authority he exuded. Every so often, she leaned closer, as if trying to communicate silently with him, her tiny finger inching toward his muscular form. The defense attorney, Ms. Lewis, attempted to counter the prosecutor's narrative, highlighting gaps and inconsistencies in the evidence. She gestured toward Rex, attempting to downplay the dog's significance in the investigation. Yet, Rex's steady calmness seemed to counter every word. Jurors, many of whom had pets of their own, couldn't help but notice the dog's controlled demeanor, his alertness, and the silent trust between him and his handler. Throughout this procedural exchange, the courtroom's atmosphere began to shift subtly. The usual tension of a trial was punctuated by the unusual focus of a child. People whispered quietly to their neighbors, noting how Emma's attention never wavered. A reporter in the back made a discreet note, sensing that something remarkable was quietly unfolding. Even the judge cast a soft glance toward the gallery, her eyes flickering toward the little girl and the dog, recognizing the unique energy between them. Hours seemed to condense into minutes as testimony began. Witnesses described Rex's tracking abilities, his keen sense of smell, and the precise timing with which he located the suspect. Each description was detailed, technical, and occasionally dry. But in the midst of these procedural moments, Emma's silent fascination created an almost magical counterpoint. The courtroom, bound by legal formalities, was being gently humanized by the presence of a child who saw not the procedural, but the profound. It was in this context, with tension, procedure, and public attention blending into one, that the stage was set for the moment no one expected. A 3-year-old girl, clutching her stuffed rabbit, would soon speak 2 words that would reverberate through the courtroom, capturing the hearts of officers, jurors, lawyers, and witnesses alike. But before that moment, the courtroom was simply a room of waiting, eyes watching, ears listening, and hearts slowly opening to the possibility of a small, innocent miracle. Emma's finger twitched again, her eyes fixed, her body leaning imperceptibly forward. No one noticed yet the small miracle forming, except perhaps the keen observer who understood that children often see what adults cannot, the pure essence of truth, loyalty, and affection. And in the stillness, as Rex sat calmly beside Officer Miller, the courtroom's heavy air of tension seemed to pause, holding its breath, waiting for a moment that would be remembered far beyond the trial's end. Even the clock on the wall seemed to tick more slowly, marking the minutes with gentle patience. Lawyers shuffled papers. Witnesses whispered among themselves. Reporters poised their pens and cameras. And in the quiet tension, one small figure, a 3-year-old girl, prepared to alter the rhythm of the courtroom with a gesture so simple, yet so profoundly human, that it would shock, delight, and inspire everyone present. The courtroom settled into a rhythm as the trial progressed. Witnesses were called to the stand one after another, each providing detailed accounts of the series of burglaries that had shaken the neighborhood. The prosecutor, Mr. Harris, guided them carefully, asking questions that emphasized the thoroughness of the investigation and the critical role of the K-9 unit. As the first witness, a local store owner whose shop had been broken into, recited what he had seen and lost. Emma's eyes remained unwavering on Rex. While others followed the narrative of theft and evidence, Emma followed the narrative of loyalty and calm strength. Rex, sitting beside Officer Miller, was a picture of controlled focus. His ears pricked at every sound, yet his movements were minimal, restrained. Officer Miller spoke softly to him now and then, a brief word, a hand gesture, and Rex responded instantly. He was more than just a dog in uniform. He was an extension of the law, a partner whose instincts had already helped solve the case. For adults, Rex's presence was professional. For Emma, it was mesmerizing. She tilted her head, her tiny brow furrowed in concentration, as if she were silently studying him, learning his every mannerism. The next witness was a neighbor who had observed a figure fleeing the scene the night of one burglary. Her testimony was precise, but lacked the drama of the store owner's account. Emma's gaze never wavered. Her finger twitched slightly toward Rex as if to draw his attention, though she had no idea he could respond to her. Around her, the courtroom attendees whispered quietly, noting her focused demeanor. Some smiled at the sight of a child, completely absorbed in the proceedings, while others speculated on what might be going through her young mind. Meanwhile, Mr. Harris shifted the trial's focus to Rex's role. He described how the dog had tracked the suspect across fences, through backyards, and into a nearby wooded area. The jury listened intently, taking notes as the prosecutor emphasized Rex's ability to follow scents even in challenging conditions. For adults, this was impressive but technical. For Emma, it was thrilling. She leaned a little closer, clutching her stuffed rabbit, eyes wide, as if she were seeing a hero in action. She didn't understand scents or legal procedures, but she understood bravery, focus, and loyalty. Officer Miller was called to the stand to explain Rex's actions firsthand. His voice was calm, methodical, and respectful, detailing how the dog reacted to the faint trail left by the suspect and how he had alerted the officers to a hiding spot. The courtroom hung on every word. Jurors nodded thoughtfully, reporters scribbled notes rapidly, and Emma's small finger twitched again. She pointed more deliberately this time, almost instinctively, her tiny hand raised toward Rex as if saying, "I see you. I understand." Her mother, Sarah, glanced down at her, uncertain whether to intervene. She chose not to, sensing that her daughter's fascination was innocent and perhaps meaningful in its own way. The defense attorney, Ms. Lewis, rose to cross-examine Officer Miller. She questioned the reliability of a dog in complex situations, trying to create doubt in the minds of the jury. Animals, no matter how well trained, can be unpredictable, she argued, gesturing toward Rex. But Rex's calm demeanor contradicted every assertion. His ears twitched slightly, his eyes never leaving the officer, and his body remained perfectly still. Emma's gaze sharpened. She seemed to sense that Rex understood, that he was aware of every word spoken. The courtroom felt a subtle tension between the adult arguments and the quiet authority of the K-9 at the front. Throughout this back and forth, Emma remained captivated. Her small frame barely moved, but her focus was unbroken. Occasionally, she whispered to her rabbit, though no one could hear, and her eyes tracked Rex as if reading his silent responses. She didn't need to understand the intricacies of cross-examination to sense the importance of this dog's presence. Every twitch of his ears, every subtle shift in his posture, told a story that Emma seemed to grasp intuitively. Adults marveled silently at the depth of a child's perception. As the morning wore on, the courtroom began to notice Emma more. Some jurors exchanged amused glances, pointing subtly to the little girl whose eyes never left Rex. Reporters adjusted their cameras discreetly, capturing the scene that had grown into a silent story of its own. A small child observing the law in action, her attention fixed on a living embodiment of authority and loyalty. Even the judge, stern and composed, glanced toward Emma more than once, curiosity flickering in her eyes. The prosecutor then brought out a series of photographs showing Rex tracking the suspect through neighborhoods and wooded areas. The images were detailed, Rex in mid-stride, his nose close to the ground, following an invisible trail. The jury was impressed, but so was Emma. She leaned forward slightly, her finger inching closer, a soft murmur escaping her lips as if she were cheering silently. Her presence had begun to affect the atmosphere subtly. The courtroom felt warmer, more human, infused with a gentle innocence amid the serious proceedings. By noon, the trial had reached a natural pause for lunch, yet Emma remained in her mother's lap, unwilling to divert her attention from Rex. The officers and lawyers had begun to notice, exchanging quiet comments about the little girl's intense fascination. "She really likes him," whispered a court clerk, smiling. The judge observed quietly, a faint smile playing on her lips. For Emma, the pause in proceedings was irrelevant. Her focus had a purpose she couldn't yet articulate, but the story of the trial, the heroism of the dog, and the silent communication between her and Rex were unfolding perfectly in her mind. Even as court officials prepared to recess, the energy between the girl and the dog lingered. Emma's finger remained slightly raised, her eyes wide and unblinking. To any casual observer, it might have seemed like mere curiosity, But for those paying close attention, it was clear that she had already formed a connection with Rex, one that would soon culminate in a moment capable of stopping the courtroom in its tracks. The innocence of a 3-year-old, coupled with the calm authority of a trained police dog, had created a silent narrative within the formal proceedings, a narrative that no words from adults could replicate. As the gallery filed out for the break, whispers continued about the child and the dog. Jurors exchanged knowing looks, reporters jotted down notes, and even the officers smiled quietly. Emma, still seated, gently patted her rabbit and kept her gaze fixed forward. For her, the trial was no longer a series of legal procedures. It had become a story, a game, a drama of bravery and attention. And while no one yet knew exactly what would happen next, the court seemed to collectively hold its breath, sensing that a small, profound moment was on the horizon, one that would remind everyone present of the simple, unfiltered truths that children notice and adults often overlook. By the time the recess was announced, the courtroom was quietly buzzing, not with gossip about the case, but about the 3-year-old girl who had captivated everyone with her silent observation. Emma's tiny gestures, her unwavering attention, and her instinctive connection with Rex had turned what could have been a dry procedural morning into something memorable, human, and unexpectedly touching. The tension of the trial had softened slightly, replaced by a warmth that seemed to flow from innocence itself. So, as the courtroom emptied for lunch, Emma remained seated, still watching, still pointing, still silently communicating with Rex in her own way. She did not know that her moment was about to arrive, a moment that would transform a formal, tense courtroom into a scene of joy, surprise, and heartfelt emotion. The world of adults, bound by rules, procedures, and expectations, was about to collide with the world of a child's simple, honest perception, and the story of the trial would never be the same. The courtroom was alive with the subtle hum of anticipation, though most of the adults were absorbed in legal formalities. Witnesses had testified, evidence had been presented, and Officer Miller had explained in meticulous detail how Rex had tracked the suspect across yards, streets, and finally into the nearby woods. The jurors were attentive, their eyes darting between the testimony, the exhibits, and occasionally the K9 dog whose calm presence lent credibility to every word spoken. For them, Rex was professional, capable, and undeniably crucial to the case. But for Emma, seated quietly on her mother's lap, he was something entirely different. Emma's gaze had remained fixed on Rex since the morning proceedings began. Her small finger twitched occasionally as she clutched her stuffed rabbit with her other hand. She was not aware of the seriousness of the trial or the weight of the testimony being offered. She did not understand the details of burglaries or the nuances of scent tracking, but she did recognize the quiet authority, the steady focus, and the sense of reliability that emanated from Rex. Her eyes followed his every twitch, and she leaned slightly forward, as if drawn by an invisible thread connecting her to the dog. No one in the courtroom had yet noticed the subtle significance of Emma's gestures. A few jurors glanced at her every now and then, nodding her unwavering attention with mild amusement. Sarah, her mother, shifted nervously in her seat, whispering gently to Emma, "Sweetheart, sit still, okay?" But Emma did not respond. Her eyes, wide and bright, remained locked on Rex. Her small hand twitched again, rising imperceptibly, as though she were preparing to do something she could not yet articulate in words. As Officer Miller continued his testimony, describing the final moments of the chase, Rex remained perfectly still, obediently at his handler's side. His eyes were sharp, scanning the courtroom, alert to the tone of voices, the subtle movements of people, and the instructions from Officer Miller. Children like Emma could sense the quiet communication between man and dog in ways adults often overlooked. She leaned closer, her small frame pressing slightly into her mother's lap, and instinctively extended her finger toward Rex. The gesture was small but deliberate, a child's instinctive recognition of competence, bravery, and trust. Suddenly, the gesture became noticeable. A reporter in the back whispered to a colleague, "Look at that little girl pointing at the dog. Isn't that something? A juror nudged another, smiling quietly. She seems really focused on him. The murmurs were soft, almost reverent, as if acknowledging that the moment unfolding was different from the routine flow of the trial. Even the judge, while maintaining her professional demeanor, allowed her eyes to flick toward Emma. There was a curiosity there, a faint recognition that something extraordinary was quietly forming in the gallery. The defense attorney, Ms. Lewis, had risen again, questioning Officer Miller about the potential for human error in relying on a dog for tracking. Animals can be unpredictable, she argued, gesturing toward Rex. But Rex remained unmoved, a picture of discipline and professionalism. Emma's finger twitched again, this time more clearly pointing at the dog. It was a subtle act, but in the hush of the courtroom it carried weight. Her mother noticed and instinctively looked down at her daughter, unsure whether to intervene or let the innocent gesture continue. Something told Sarah that this was a moment she might never see again, and she chose to remain silent. The prosecutor, noticing the subtle distraction, paused briefly. Mr. Harris's eyes swept the courtroom and settled on Emma. He smiled slightly, realizing that the innocence of a child could convey a kind of truth that legal arguments could not. The courtroom seemed to collectively hold its breath, sensing that the dynamics of the trial were shifting in a gentle but meaningful way. Witnesses continued their testimony, officers answered questions, and lawyers maintained their decorum. But all of it was now subtly framed by the quiet interaction between the girl and the dog. As the minutes ticked by, Emma's finger remained pointed, unwavering. She did not fidget, she did not lose focus, and she did not speak. But her gesture spoke volumes. The subtle authority of Rex and the quiet observation of Emma created an almost imperceptible dialogue that everyone present could feel. Even the most serious, stoic courtroom attendees could not help but notice the pure, unspoken communication between child and K9. There was an almost magical quality in the air, as though the weight of the trial had softened under the innocence of a 3-year-old's perception. During a brief lull in proceedings when officers were confirming details and the judge adjusted her notes, murmurs in the gallery became more pronounced. "Look at her pointing," whispered a court clerk. "She's fixated on the dog." Sarah felt her heart flutter. She knew her daughter was observant, even unusually perceptive for her age, but the intensity of her focus was extraordinary. Emma's tiny gesture, simple as it seemed, was beginning to capture the attention of the entire courtroom. People shifted in their seats to get a better view, and even the reporters raised their cameras discreetly, sensing a story beyond the legal proceedings. Trial resumed, with Officer Miller recounting the exact moment Rex had located the suspect hiding behind a shed. His voice was calm but precise, detailing how the dog had alerted the officers with a subtle bark and a nudge. The jury listened intently, jurors leaning forward, taking notes, absorbing every word. But Emma had already shifted her attention entirely to the moment at hand. Her finger was raised higher now, pointing directly at Rex as if to say, "I see you. I know what you did." Her lips parted slightly, and she whispered something to her rabbit, though it was inaudible to anyone else. It was clear, however, that her focus had reached a peak. The moment of action was imminent. Even the judge's attention wavered briefly. Her eyes, usually so stern and unwavering, softened as they flicked toward the gallery. She noticed Emma's intensity, the quiet authority of Rex, and the unspoken connection forming between them. The trial's formal tension was momentarily replaced by a gentle curiosity, an acknowledgement that something unexpected and profound was about to occur. The courtroom, for a fleeting but memorable instant, became a stage for innocence to intersect with authority in a way that no legal argument could replicate. As the cross-examination continued, Emma's finger remained extended. Jurors, reporters, and spectators couldn't help but notice her gesture now. Whispers spread quietly. "Is she going to say something? How old is she? Look at her. She's so focused on that dog." The energy in the room shifted from procedural seriousness to quiet anticipation. Everyone sensed that a simple act of a child could alter the rhythm of the courtroom. bringing warmth and humanity into a space otherwise dominated by rules, arguments, and evidence. By the time the morning session neared its midpoint, it was impossible for anyone to ignore the subtle yet powerful presence of the 3-year-old girl. Emma's gesture, her finger pointing steadily at Rex, had become the silent heartbeat of the courtroom. Adults found themselves stealing glances, reporters prepared their notes, and even the officers exchanged amused, knowing smiles. The stage was set for a moment that would forever be remembered, not for legal arguments, evidence, or procedural points, but for the simple, honest, unfiltered reaction of a child recognizing bravery, loyalty, and truth. And so, as Officer Miller continued his testimony and the prosecutor guided the narrative, Emma's tiny hand remained raised, unwavering, her eyes locked on the dog. The courtroom collectively held its breath, sensing that the small gesture was a precursor to something extraordinary. A 3-year-old's innocent perception had begun to create a silent tension, a quiet expectation, and a gentle anticipation. No one knew exactly what would happen next, but everyone in the room was waiting, heart and mind attuned, for the moment that would soon unfold and change the tone of the trial forever. The courtroom seemed to lean forward as the morning's proceedings continued. Witnesses had recounted details of the burglaries, the evidence had been laid out meticulously, and Officer Miller had described Rex's precise tracking abilities. Jurors were focused, lawyers poised, and the judge monitored every word, maintaining her calm authority. But amidst the formal decorum, a quiet anticipation began to ripple through the room, though few realized its source. All attention was now subtly, almost imperceptibly, drawn toward a small figure in the gallery, a 3-year-old girl who had been quietly observing the dog, her finger slowly rising toward Rex. Emma's gaze had never wavered. Her eyes, wide and earnest, followed Rex's every motion, from the subtle twitch of his ears to the gentle sway of his tail. She clutched her stuffed rabbit, her other hand now gently resting on her mother's arm, but her focus was unwavering. She had been silently communicating with him for hours in her own way, using gestures, expressions, and the small, instinctive motions only a child could interpret. And now, the moment had arrived. The air in the courtroom seemed to pause, holding its collective breath in anticipation. The prosecutor had just asked Officer Miller to describe how Rex had located the suspect behind the shed, detailing how the dog's training allowed him to differentiate between sense and track with astonishing precision. The jurors scribbled notes, nodding at the officer's thorough explanation. Reporter cameras clicked quietly, capturing every detail for the record. And then, almost imperceptibly at first, a soft voice emerged from the gallery. "Good boy." The words were so small at first that only Sarah, Emma's mother, heard them clearly. But immediately the courtroom reacted. A hush fell over the room. All eyes turned to the gallery, where the source of the voice became visible, a tiny 3-year-old, smiling shyly, her finger still extended toward Rex. The simplicity and innocence of her statement contrasted sharply with the formal atmosphere of legal arguments and testimony. In that instant, the courtroom collectively froze, stunned by the unexpected clarity and timing of Emma's words. Officer Miller instinctively bent down, kneeling slightly to bring himself closer to the dog's level. "Did you hear that, Rex?" he murmured gently. Rex's ears flicked, his tail wagged slightly, and he responded with the subtle body language of recognition. For him, the sound of the words was meaningless, but the tone, the innocence, and the presence of the child conveyed a sense of trust and approval. Emma's tiny voice had transformed the atmosphere in a way that no amount of legal argument or evidence could replicate. Jurors blinked, unsure if they had heard correctly. The judge, her eyebrows raised in surprise, allowed a faint smile to cross her face. Even the sternest attorneys, who had spent years presenting and challenging evidence in courtrooms across the city, were caught off guard. The formality of the trial seemed momentarily suspended, replaced by a gentle warmth and universal recognition of the purity of the moment. Witnesses, reporters, and spectators leaned forward, captivated by the unexpected power of two simple words. Sarah felt a mixture of pride and astonishment. She whispered to her daughter, "Emma, honey, you spoke to him." But Emma, sensing the attention, simply smiled wider and looked back at Rex. Her words had been pure and unforced, an expression of admiration, recognition, and encouragement. She did not yet understand the impact of her statement, but the courtroom understood immediately. It was a moment that transcended age, profession, and expectation. The prosecutor seized the moment gracefully. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Mr. Harris said, his voice calm but tinged with warmth, "you have just witnessed the bond between an officer, his K-9 partner, and the community. Even a child recognizes the trust and dedication these animals bring to law enforcement." The jurors nodded, acknowledging the power of the moment, while the defense attorney, Ms. Lewis, paused briefly, caught between professional decorum and the undeniable emotional resonance in the room. Rex, oblivious to the formal significance of the trial, responded naturally to the attention. His tail wagged once more, subtle but noticeable, and his head tilted slightly toward Emma, as if acknowledging her words. The officer smiled, understanding that this small gesture of a child had elevated the dog's presence in a way no courtroom argument ever could. The subtle communication, the trust, and the innocence all intertwined in a moment that felt simultaneously fleeting and eternal. Soft laughter rippled through the gallery. Reporters quickly repositioned their cameras to capture the interaction, sensing that they were witnessing more than just a courtroom procedural. They were capturing a story of human connection, empathy, and the extraordinary perception of a child. The audience, previously tense and focused on legal minutiae, now leaned back, smiling, eyes warm, hearts touched by a single, simple phrase. Even the judge allowed herself a momentary display of warmth. She tapped her gavel lightly, restoring a semblance of courtroom order, though the atmosphere had permanently shifted. "Well," she said softly, "that's certainly unexpected. Thank you, young lady." Sarah's cheeks flushed as she guided Emma gently back into her mother's lap. Emma, however, remained beaming, her attention still partly on Rex, clearly pleased with the effect of her words. The defense attorney, recovering her composure, continued her cross-examination, but the energy in the room had changed. Arguments that had felt sharp and procedural now seemed slightly softer, humanized by the presence of a child and the instinctive recognition of Rex's abilities. The jurors, witnesses, and spectators were subtly reminded that the courtroom, often filled with tension and strategy, was still a space where innocence, truth, and empathy could shine. Outside the immediate courtroom, the story began to take on a life of its own. The courtroom clerk whispered to colleagues about the remarkable moment. Reporters began jotting notes, anticipating how they would tell the story to readers, understanding that the headline would focus not only on the trial, but on the unforgettable interaction between a child and a police dog. Social media would later amplify it, but in that moment, everyone present felt the unique power of Emma's words and the emotional resonance they carried. For Emma, the experience was simple and joyful. She had acknowledged a friend, a hero in fur and loyalty, and in doing so had captivated an entire room of adults. She did not understand the larger context, the legal consequences, or the media attention her words would later receive. She only understood that Rex had done something impressive, that he was kind and strong, and that her words mattered. In her innocence, she had become the bridge between the formal proceedings and the human heart of the courtroom. The prosecutor wrapped up his point, referencing the reliability and skill of K-9 units, now illustrated not just by evidence but by the natural, instinctive recognition of a child. The jury, visibly moved, listened with heightened attention. Jurors whispered softly among themselves, commenting on the scene with words like "remarkable" and "so pure." The judge, maintaining professional decorum, allowed subtle smiles to break through the otherwise serious atmosphere, acknowledging that sometimes the simplest gestures carry the most profound weight. By the end of the morning session, the courtroom had been transformed. Emma's 2 words, "Good boy," had become the defining moment of the trial so far. Lawyers, witnesses, jurors, and officers were quietly reflective, touched by a reminder that even in serious, procedural spaces, humanity and innocence could shine with unexpected clarity. The courtroom was no longer merely a place of rules, evidence, and argument. It had become a place where the simple, unfiltered perception of a child reminded everyone of courage, loyalty, and truth. Emma's mother, holding her daughter gently, marveled at the effect. She whispered softly, "You just changed everyone's morning, Emma." Emma responded with a shy smile, blissfully unaware of the magnitude of her impact. For her, the joy was simple, acknowledging a friend, expressing her admiration, and feeling connected to a loyal, intelligent companion. And in doing so, she had reminded everyone in the courtroom that sometimes, honesty and kindness need no explanation, just observation and courage to speak. As the jury filed out for a brief recess, whispers of Emma's words filled the room. "Did you hear what she said? Incredible, isn't it? Such a simple, powerful thing." Reporters adjusted their cameras, officers chuckled quietly, and the judge allowed a small smile before returning her attention to notes. Emma's 2 words had transcended the ordinary flow of the trial, leaving an indelible mark on everyone present. They would carry the story beyond the walls of the courthouse, into the media, social networks, and the hearts of countless people across the city. The room had been transformed by a moment so small, yet so profound. 2 words spoken by a 3-year-old with pure intention had captured the essence of bravery, trust, and innocence. And as the session paused, everyone in the courtroom knew they had witnessed something extraordinary, not just in law enforcement or legal proceedings, but in human connection. A child had reminded them all that sometimes the simplest gestures carry the deepest meaning. The courtroom, once filled with the steady rhythm of procedural testimony, now hummed with a different energy. Emma's 2 words, "Good boy," hung in the air, echoing far beyond their literal meaning. They were simple, innocent, and pure, yet their effect was profound. Jurors, who had spent hours weighing evidence and calculating probabilities, found themselves smiling in a way they hadn't expected. Witnesses paused, momentarily forgetting the intensity of their testimony, caught in the warmth radiating from the tiny girl's observation. Lawyers, officers, and even the stern judge felt a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. Officer Miller glanced down at Rex. The dog's alert eyes met the officer, and a small wag of his tail suggested an almost imperceptible acknowledgement of the praise. Rex, trained to respond to commands and subtle cues, had never experienced this type of feedback, a genuine, heartfelt compliment from a child. To him, it was a new kind of communication, one devoid of authority or command, and yet equally meaningful. Emma's gesture had humanized him in a way that procedure never could. Jurors whispered softly among themselves. One juror, a middle-aged man who had been furrowing his brow over technical details moments ago, leaned to his neighbor and murmured, "Did you hear that? That little girl, she's right. He really is a good boy." The remark, simple as it was, conveyed a shared understanding that transcended words. In that courtroom, the logic of law and the innocence of youth converged, creating a rare moment where professionalism and humanity met seamlessly. Sarah, Emma's mother, sat quietly, marveling at her daughter. She had anticipated that Emma might enjoy seeing Rex, perhaps even giggle at his size or bark, but she had not expected her tiny voice to command the attention of an entire courtroom. A sense of pride mingled with disbelief. "That's my little girl," she whispered softly, brushing Emma's hair from her face. Emma's eyes sparkled with delight, completely oblivious to the ripples she had created, simply thrilled that Rex seemed to respond to her praise. The judge, maintaining her composure, tapped her gavel lightly. "Well," she said, her voice carrying a hint of amusement, "that is certainly unexpected." Her words were deliberate, measured, but the faint curve of her lips betrayed a genuine smile. The courtroom, professional and disciplined as it was, now carried an undercurrent of warmth. The formal procedures of law had been momentarily softened by innocence, a reminder that even in a room filled with adults, sometimes truth and recognition could come from the smallest voice. Even the defense attorney, Ms. Lewis, paused mid-sentence. She had been preparing a detailed rebuttal about the reliability of K-9 units in investigations, emphasizing potential errors. But in that instant, the room's focus shifted. The emotional weight of Emma's words subtly reinforced Rex's credibility in a way no legal argument could. Ms. Lewis, though maintaining professional decorum, found herself briefly moved. Her expression softened, just slightly, as if acknowledging that the courtroom had witnessed something remarkable beyond the confines of evidence and procedure. Reporters in the back of the courtroom were quick to notice. Cameras clicked quietly, capturing Emma pointing at Rex, the smile on her face, and the subtle interaction between the dog and his handler. Notes were scribbled, pens paused mid-motion, and some reporters whispered to one another, already framing the story in their minds. This was no longer a standard burglary trial. It had become a human interest story, one that highlighted innocence, courage, and the quiet heroism of a police dog. The gallery's spectators, too, were affected. Local residents who had come to observe the trial found themselves leaning forward, captivated not by legal arguments, but by the interaction between a child and a dog. The tension of courtroom procedure gave way to soft smiles, murmurs of delight, and occasional chuckles. Even those who were normally critical, skeptical, or focused on procedural minutiae felt their hearts warmed. Emma's simple words had transcended the formal walls of the courtroom, touching everyone present in a visceral, almost unexplainable way. Officer Miller knelt slightly, whispering softly to Rex, "You see, even the little ones understand you." Rex tilted his head, ears flicking, tail wagging minutely, a subtle acknowledgement that the praise, while unfamiliar in form, was appreciated. It was as if Emma had bridged a gap between instinct and recognition, between training and emotional validation. For the first time, the courtroom witnessed the profound effect of human connection on law enforcement in its most innocent form. The prosecutor, Mr. Harris, seized the moment with a careful but heartfelt statement. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "what you just witnessed demonstrates the trust and bond between law enforcement and the community. Even a child recognizes the dedication, loyalty, and skill of our K-9 units. It's a reminder that truth is not only measured in facts, but in understanding, respect, and recognition." The jurors nodded, some with smiles, absorbing the moment in a way that extended far beyond legal reasoning. Outside the immediate courtroom proceedings, the ripple effect had begun. Courtroom staff whispered about the event, sharing amused and heartwarming observations. "Did you see that little girl?" one clerk asked. "She's incredible. And Rex, what a calm dog." Reporters adjusted their cameras, realizing that this story would captivate readers beyond the city limits. It was more than a trial. It was a narrative of empathy, innocence, and the extraordinary perception of a child. Emma, blissfully unaware of the full effect of her words, leaned back in her mother's lap, satisfied. She had acknowledged a friend, expressed admiration, and felt the joy of recognition. For her, the courtroom was no longer a formal, intimidating place. It had become a stage where her instincts and perception mattered. And in doing so, she had altered the emotional landscape of everyone present. Adults who had been tense and focused on evidence were reminded of the power of small gestures, of observation, and of the simple but profound language of human connection. The judge called for a short recess, and as the gallery began to shuffle, conversations erupted quietly. "That little girl, amazing," whispered one juror. "I can't get over it," said another. The officers and lawyers shared smiles and subtle nods, recognizing that the courtroom had just witnessed something rare. Emma's two words, so small, so unassuming, had created an unforgettable emotional ripple that would be remembered long after the trial ended. Even the legal professionals, accustomed to strategy and debate, recognized the power of the moment. Evidence and arguments were important, but this small act of recognition resonated deeper. It reminded everyone that law and justice are not only abstract concepts but are grounded in humanity, empathy, and connection. And in this case, a 3-year-old girl had reminded them all, in the most unexpected way, that innocence could illuminate truth more profoundly than words alone. As the courtroom emptied for lunch, Emma's tiny hand lowered, but the effect lingered. People whispered, smiled, and reflected on what they had seen. The story had already begun to take shape in the minds of all present. Emma had, without intent or awareness, created a moment that would ripple far beyond the walls of the courthouse, an extraordinary testament to innocence, observation, and the unique bond between humans and animals. And in the quiet behind the formal proceedings, Officer Miller patted Rex gently, acknowledging the dog's calm response to a child's admiration. The bond between them had been strengthened in a way no training could replicate. Emma, unaware of the broader impact of her actions, simply smiled, delighted that Rex seemed happy. The courtroom, however, would never forget the morning when 2 words, spoken with pure intent, changed the atmosphere entirely, leaving a lasting impression of warmth, humanity, and simple joy. By the time the courtroom recessed for lunch, the story of Emma's 2 words had begun to take on a life of its own. What had started as a quiet, intimate gesture, a 3-year-old girl pointing at and praising a police dog, was now quietly reverberating throughout the courthouse. Courtroom staff whispered among themselves, reporters adjusted their cameras, and jurors exchanged glances, still smiling at the memory of the simple, unexpected moment. It was a rare instance when innocence and human connection cut through the formal, tense atmosphere of a trial and made an unforgettable mark. In the press room, reporters who had been covering the trial were buzzing with excitement. Notes were hastily jotted down, camera footage reviewed, and social media accounts quietly updated. "Did you see that little girl?" one reporter asked, barely able to contain a smile. 2 words, "good boy," and she just changed the mood of the entire courtroom. People will eat this up. Editors quickly began considering how to frame the story, not just as a courtroom anecdote, but as a heartwarming human interest piece that showcased innocence, bravery, and the bond between a child and a working police dog. Outside the courthouse, locals were already discussing the incident. Parents who had accompanied their own children to observe the trial were recounting the story with awe. "You should have seen her," one parent said to another. "She just pointed at the dog and said, 'Good boy.'" The entire room stopped. The story spread quickly through word of mouth, amplified by smartphones and social media. Images of Emma sitting in her mother's lap and pointing at Rex began circulating, capturing the public's imagination. People were enchanted by the purity of the moment, its simplicity, and its honesty. In the courtroom itself, the effect lingered. Officers who had been in countless trials with K-9 partners commented quietly on the unusual impact of a child's recognition. "I've seen Rex track suspects in all sorts of conditions," one officer whispered to a colleague. "But I've never seen a child validate his work in a way that just stops everyone and reminds them why we do this." Even the defense attorney, Ms. Lewis, who had been focused on challenging the reliability of the dog, couldn't help but smile. The innocence of a 3-year-old had introduced a perspective that transcended argument and evidence. Social media quickly picked up the story. Local news outlets published photos and short video clips, capturing Emma pointing at Rex and uttering her 2 words. The hashtags began trending: "Good boy Rex," "Courtroom hero," "Little girl big impact." Within hours, the story spread beyond the city limits, capturing hearts nationwide. Comments poured in from strangers across the country, parents marveling at Emma's focus, dog lovers celebrating Rex's calm demeanor, and ordinary citizens touched by the warmth and authenticity of the moment. The story became more than just a trial anecdote. It was a reflection of human connection and the unspoken bond between children and animals. Schools and local organizations began reaching out to the K-9 unit, asking if Rex and Officer Miller could visit and share the story. Children were captivated by the narrative of bravery, observation, and reward, while teachers used the story to illustrate lessons in responsibility, trust, and empathy. Emma's mother, Sarah, received calls and messages from neighbors and friends celebrating her daughter's spontaneous act of kindness. It was clear that what had happened in that courtroom would resonate far beyond the legal proceedings themselves. Meanwhile, Officer Miller and Rex experienced a subtle but tangible elevation in their recognition. They were no longer just a police officer and his trained K-9. They had become symbols of dedication, skill, and the extraordinary relationship between humans and animals. Local news stations requested interviews, and community leaders invited them to speak at public events. Children flocked to meet Rex, inspired by the story and eager to witness the calm intelligence that had captivated Emma. The courtroom's moment of innocence had now transformed into a citywide celebration of loyalty, courage, and trust. Even within the legal community, the story generated quiet reflection. Judges, lawyers, and courtroom staff remarked on how a simple, unassuming act of a child could alter the tone of a formal proceeding. "It reminds us," one judge commented to a colleague later, "that law is not just about rules and evidence. It's also about people, empathy, and the human heart." The incident became a case study of sorts, highlighting the emotional and psychological impact that children's perception and innocence can have, even in the most structured, professional environments. Back in the courthouse, the trial resumed after the lunch recess. Though proceedings continued in a formal sense, the emotional energy had shifted. Jurors were more relaxed, witnesses less tense, and even the attorneys seemed subtly aware that the courtroom had been touched by something extraordinary. Every time Rex moved or adjusted his position, eyes would unconsciously drift to him, reminded of the moment when a child had spoken words that resonated far deeper than evidence or argument. Emma, blissfully unaware of the broader implications, leaned back in her mother's lap, content and proud that her small action had made an impact she could not yet comprehend. The story quickly became a teaching moment. Officer Miller used it as an example when training new K-9 units, emphasizing the value of calm, disciplined behavior, and the sometimes unexpected ways that dogs impact communities. Local law enforcement officials highlighted the moment in presentations and community outreach, explaining how K-9 units not only assist in investigations, but also foster trust, compassion, and inspiration. Emma's words had done more than validate Rex. They had reminded everyone present that acts of innocence and recognition have power far beyond their simplicity. The story also spread internationally. News outlets picked up the clip, and social media posts circulated globally, celebrating the bond between children and animals. Across the world, people marveled at the pure, unfiltered joy of a 3-year-old recognizing a dog's bravery. Parents shared similar stories of their children, and K-9 units everywhere celebrated the moment as a testament to the universal appeal of loyalty, trust, and innocence. Emma had become an unexpected ambassador of childhood empathy and observation, her words bridging gaps between professions, generations, and cultures. Even within the courtroom, the impact lingered. Lawyers adjusted their approach, recognizing the subtle emotional weight the story carried. Witnesses recounted their testimony with renewed focus, aware that they were part of a case now remembered for more than procedural accuracy. Jurors continued to reflect on the balance between legal evidence and the intuitive understanding that innocence can provide. And Rex, unaware of the widespread attention he had garnered, continued to sit calmly by Officer Miller, a silent hero validated in the purest form possible, through the recognition of a child. Sarah, Emma's mother, marveled at how quickly the story had grown. What had seemed like a small, intimate moment had blossomed into something extraordinary, touching people far beyond their own circle. She reflected on how children, in their simplicity, often see truths that adults overlook. Emma had noticed the calm competence of Rex, had recognized his reliability and loyalty, and had expressed it with 2 words. And those 2 words had sparked a chain reaction. proof that even the smallest voices can create a profound ripple in the world. By the end of the day, the story had solidified its place in public memory. Headlines celebrated Emma's words, photos of her pointing at Rex circulated widely, and news commentators reflected on the rare moment of pure innocence in a formal courtroom. The ripple effect extended into local schools, community centers, and online platforms, emphasizing the profound impact of kindness, recognition, and unfiltered human perception. What had begun as a simple act had become a narrative of hope, connection, and joy. And so the courtroom, once merely a site of legal procedure, had become a stage for humanity. Emma's voice, small yet mighty, had reminded everyone present that compassion and recognition do not depend on age, experience, or status. In two simple words, she had bridged the gap between authority and innocence, law and empathy, dog and human. Her story and Rex's calm presence would continue to inspire, remind, and warm hearts for months and years to come. In the days following the trial, the story of Emma and Rex captured the hearts of the community in ways that no one could have anticipated. The local news continued to run segments highlighting the 3-year-old girl who had, with two simple words, stopped a courtroom in its tracks. Social media posts featuring photos and videos of Emma pointing at Rex went viral, and people shared stories of their own experiences with children and animals, creating a wave of warmth and connection across neighborhoods. It was a reminder that small, genuine acts can resonate far beyond their immediate context. The K-9 unit received invitations from schools, libraries, and community centers to share Rex's story and demonstrate his work. Officer Miller, recognizing the educational opportunity, gladly accepted. One morning, the local elementary school hosted a special assembly. Children gathered in the gymnasium, buzzing with excitement, as Rex and Officer Miller walked in. Emma, now a little more comfortable in the spotlight, proudly waved from the front row. When she saw Rex trotting in, tail wagging and ears perked, she whispered to her mother, "He remembers me," and her eyes sparkled with delight. Officer Miller began by explaining Rex's role in law enforcement, how he tracked suspects, detected substances, and assisted officers in keeping communities safe. But he also emphasized the qualities that Emma had recognized: loyalty, calmness under pressure, and the quiet heroism of a dog who gives everything without expectation. Children listened, captivated, asking questions and giggling when Rex performed simple commands. The innocence of the moment mirrored the courtroom, but now it was magnified across a wider audience. Emma's two words had become a bridge, connecting adults and children, law enforcement and the public, seriousness and joy. Local community leaders and educators noticed the broader lessons embedded in the story. Teachers used it as an example of observation, empathy, and recognition. Children were encouraged to notice small acts of kindness in their own lives, to value the contributions of others, and to express gratitude in honest, simple ways. Emma's action, initially a spontaneous moment of admiration, became a teaching tool that resonated far beyond the courtroom walls. Children learned that even tiny gestures could have profound meaning. The media coverage continued to grow. Newspapers, online publications, and television segments highlighted the story as a rare, uplifting event amid often serious or distressing news cycles. Interviews with Sarah, Emma's mother, emphasized the simplicity of the act. A child noticing a dog's calm courage and speaking two words that resonated with every adult present. The story struck a chord nationwide, reminding people that innocence often sees truths that experience and training can sometimes overlook. Officer Miller and Rex were invited to community fairs, local parades, and public safety events. Everywhere they went, children and adults alike flocked to see the calm, capable dog who had captivated a courtroom, and the girl who had recognized him. Emma became something of a local celebrity, not in a boastful or showy way, but as a symbol of the impact one small, genuine gesture can have. People praised her focus, her honesty, and the way she had expressed admiration without expectation or pretense. Within the law enforcement community, Emma's story sparked reflection on human-animal partnerships. Officers shared tales of K-9 units and their profound influence on both cases and communities, but few examples were as emotionally resonant as the courtroom moment. Training programs began incorporating discussions about the public perception of K-9 work, emphasizing not only technical skill, but also the intangible impact of trust, recognition, and emotional intelligence. Emma's gesture, though small and simple, became a case study of how innocence can highlight values that adults sometimes overlook. Emma herself, still a 3-year-old with wide-eyed curiosity, continued to observe Rex whenever she could. She visited the K-9 unit regularly, learning simple commands and watching demonstrations. Every visit reinforced her understanding of trust, loyalty, and respect. To her, Rex was not just a dog, he was a hero and a friend. And in a way only a child can understand, she had validated his efforts in the most heartfelt way possible. Every wag of his tail, every alert movement, seemed to reflect recognition of her presence, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond they had formed in the courtroom. The courtroom that had once seemed intimidating now felt like a stage where genuine human connection had taken center focus. Adults reflected on how Emma's presence had softened the atmosphere, reminding them that empathy and understanding are integral to justice as much as evidence and procedure. Lawyers, jurors, and officers spoke privately about the lesson embedded in her small act, that recognition and appreciation, even from the youngest among us, carry an extraordinary power to influence, calm, and humanize tense situations. Schools across the city adopted the story as a teaching tool. Teachers held discussions about bravery, kindness, and observing the efforts of others. Students were encouraged to notice and appreciate small actions, whether in their families, communities, or among classmates. Emma's story became part of lesson plans on character, empathy, and emotional intelligence, inspiring countless children to express gratitude and admiration for the contributions of those around them. Meanwhile, Emma's mother noticed subtle changes in her daughter's personality. The experience had instilled confidence, awareness, and a quiet sense of responsibility. Emma began noticing details in her environment with greater precision, recognizing effort and kindness wherever she saw it. She offered encouragement spontaneously, pointing out accomplishments of family, friends, and even strangers. Her 2 words in the courtroom had been a singular moment, but their impact shaped the way she interacted with the world around her. Even in local government offices and community programs, the story of Emma and Rex became an example of the power of human connection. Community leaders spoke of the importance of fostering empathy in children, of creating opportunities to observe and recognize service, and of cultivating gratitude as a core value. Emma, unknowingly, had catalyzed a wave of reflection on societal values, reminding everyone that even the smallest voice can inspire meaningful change. The local K-9 unit capitalized on the attention to launch community outreach programs. Officer Miller and Rex participated in school visits, neighborhood events, and public demonstrations. Their work was celebrated not only for its technical skill, but for the emotional resonance it carried. Each appearance included a reminder of the courtroom moment, a simple child's praise that had inspired adults, jurors, officers, and reporters alike. Emma's 2 words had become symbolic, representing the potential of innocence and recognition to create lasting impact. Months passed, but the story endured. Media coverage revisited the courtroom incident, community events highlighted the tale, and schools continued to share the lesson. Emma, now slightly older, remained captivated by Rex, visiting him regularly and learning about his training and capabilities. She had become a small but persistent reminder to everyone around her that the simplest gestures, observation, praise, recognition, carry a power that no law, policy, or procedure can fully capture. The courtroom itself became somewhat of a local legend. Visitors who attended later trials would hear whispered references to the 3-year-old girl and the K-9 dog. Lawyers recounted the story to new jurors. Officers used it to illustrate the human impact of their work, and reporters referenced it when covering similar cases. Emma's 2 words, spoken in the innocence and sincerity only a child could summon, transcended the walls of the courtroom, embedding themselves into community memory as a symbol of hope, recognition, and empathy. In every sense, Emma and Rex had become more than participants in a trial. They had become a story, a lesson, and an inspiration. Adults reflected on the simplicity and purity of the moment. Children learned the value of observation and recognition, and the city embraced the tale as a reminder of how even the smallest acts can leave an indelible mark. Emma, good boy, had been 2 words, but their impact was immeasurable, echoing across communities and hearts alike. The trial eventually reached its conclusion, but the memory of Emma's 2 words, good boy, lingered in the minds of everyone present. The courtroom, once tense with testimony and evidence, had transformed into a space of warmth and human connection. Jurors, witnesses, officers, and attorneys alike reflected on the profound impact of a simple, sincere gesture. Even as the legal proceedings drew to a close, the story that had unfolded would not end with the verdict. It had already created a ripple that would extend far beyond the courthouse walls. The jury deliberated with care, reviewing evidence and weighing testimony as they had been instructed. But even within the solemnity of their decision-making, the memory of Emma's gesture persisted. They recalled the calm confidence of Rex, the precise and disciplined work of the K-9 unit, and the quiet recognition of a child who had observed with clarity that no adult argument could surpass. When the verdict was finally announced, guilty, the courtroom reacted with measured attention, but in many hearts, it was Emma's innocence and intuition that remained the defining memory. After the trial, Officer Miller returned to the K-9 unit with Rex, but the bond formed during that extraordinary courtroom session only deepened. Emma continued to visit regularly, each time excitedly running toward Rex with the same enthusiasm and respect she had shown during the trial. She brought her stuffed rabbit, always holding it in one hand, while the other reached out to pat Rex's head or scratch behind his ears. Each visit reinforced the unique connection that had begun with a single gesture and 2 simple words. The local community celebrated the pair with admiration. Schools organized special presentations, inviting children to meet Rex and hear Officer Miller recount the courtroom story. The narrative emphasized trust, observation, empathy, and recognition, all inspired by a child's perspective. Emma, slightly older and increasingly articulate, began explaining to her classmates why she had praised Rex and what it meant to appreciate someone's efforts. Her story inspired classmates to express gratitude for their own friends, pets, and community helpers, creating a ripple of empathy throughout the city. Local media revisited the story repeatedly, highlighting the broader lessons Emma had unintentionally taught. Interviews with Officer Miller focused not only on Rex's work, but also on the way human connection and recognition could enhance the bond between officers, their K-9 partners, and the community. Social media users continued to share photos and videos, often adding captions about how a child's perspective could remind adults of fundamental truths about trust, loyalty, and kindness. What had begun as a brief, innocent comment now held symbolic weight. Sarah, Emma's mother, watched in quiet pride as her daughter's influence grew. She marveled at how a spontaneous act of observation had shaped public perception, fostered education, and created a lasting legacy for her child. Emma remained unaware of the broader attention, but her natural curiosity and sense of fairness guided her every action. Sarah reflected on the extraordinary simplicity of the moment. A child had recognized bravery and dedication, spoken 2 words, and touched the hearts of an entire courtroom, a city, and eventually a nation. The K-9 unit began incorporating Emma's story into training programs for new officers. They emphasized the importance of calmness, observation, and reliability, highlighting how Rex had demonstrated qualities that even a 3-year-old could recognize. New recruits learned that technical skill was essential, but so too was the capacity to inspire trust and admiration. The courtroom incident became a teaching moment not only for law enforcement, but for the broader community, illustrating the profound ways that human-animal partnerships could influence perception, behavior, and values. Over time, Emma and Rex became symbols of courage, recognition, and the innocence of childhood insight. Community centers held workshops on empathy. Schools celebrated Good Boy Days where students learned about trust and loyalty, and local media continued to reference the story as a timeless reminder that even the smallest voice can create a meaningful impact. Children across the city were encouraged to observe, notice, and express appreciation for the efforts of others, inspired by Emma's instinctive understanding of Rex's value. Emma's life itself began to reflect the lessons she had inadvertently shared. She became more observant, patient, and considerate, qualities that continued to develop naturally as she interacted with Rex, her family, and her community. She noticed the quiet efforts of friends, the kindness of strangers, and the value of small gestures, often verbalizing praise in her gentle, clear voice. Those 2 words, good boy, had become a foundation for her own emerging sense of ethics, empathy, and awareness. Meanwhile, Officer Miller and Rex continued their work with the K-9 unit, but the courtroom story became part of their enduring legacy. Rex's calm, reliable presence continued to inspire confidence in the community, and Officer Miller often reminded colleagues that recognition, no matter how small, could create profound effects. The story was cited in local law enforcement newsletters, shared during public safety demonstrations, and highlighted during training sessions, ensuring that the lesson Emma had imparted would continue to influence others for years to come. Years later, Emma and Rex would occasionally revisit the courtroom, not for legal proceedings, but for community events designed to celebrate the unique bond they had formed. Each visit reminded everyone present of the power of observation, trust, and recognition. Children who had grown up hearing the story brought their own families to witness the pair, ensuring that the message of empathy and admiration continued across generations. The courtroom itself became symbolic, a place where innocence, bravery, and recognition intersected, forever linked to the story of a 3-year-old girl and a police dog. Even the broader public remained enchanted by the story. Online communities frequently revisited the viral clip of Emma pointing at Rex and saying, "Good boy." Discussions ranged from parenting and child psychology to law enforcement and community relations. Everyone agreed that the moment was rare and unforgettable. The precision of Rex's work validated, the courtroom's formality softened, and the truth recognized through the eyes of a child. In a world often dominated by complexity and skepticism, 2 simple words reminded people of clarity, honesty, and the enduring value of empathy. As Emma grew older, her connection to Rex remained a touchstone in her life. She learned responsibility, patience, and care, attributes nurtured by her interactions with the dog. Each visit reinforced the understanding that acknowledgement and gratitude are powerful tools, capable of transforming not only the recipient but the observer as well. The lesson was universal. The innocence of childhood could illuminate truths that experience sometimes overlooks, and kindness, however small, carries the weight of immeasurable impact. Ultimately, the courtroom moment became a story of lasting legacy. Emma's spontaneous gesture, her 2 words, and her sincere observation had transcended a single trial to touch an entire community, inspire countless children, and influence the way law enforcement interacted with the public. It became a narrative celebrated for its simplicity, emotional depth, and profound resonance, reminding everyone that courage, recognition, and empathy often speak loudest when expressed without expectation, in the purity of genuine admiration. And so, the tale of Emma and Rex became a timeless reminder. In a world where complexity often overshadows simplicity, it is sometimes the smallest voices and the simplest acts that leave the deepest mark. Emma's 2 words had transformed more than a courtroom. They had transformed hearts, perspectives, and a community. The girl who pointed and spoke, and the dog who embodied calm, loyalty, and courage, became symbols of enduring human connection, reminding everyone that even in formal, structured spaces, sincerity and recognition can create ripples that last a lifetime.